On a stormy night in October 1871, in the small Wyoming town of Medicine Bow, Sheriff Elric McClinchey sat in the dimly lit jailhouse, listening to the relentless pounding of rain against the tin roof. His deputy, M.K. Boswell, sat across from him, boots propped on the desk, a pipe smoldering in his hand. The two men spoke in low voices about the bitter winter ahead, their breath visible in the cold air. Lightning cracked outside, momentarily illuminating the single window in the office. A heavy gust of wind rattled the walls, but it was the sudden, hollow knock at the door that made both men stiffen. McClinchey exchanged a wary glance with Boswell before the deputy stood and approached the door. When Boswell opened it, a figure stumbled forward, collapsing onto the floor with a dull thud. The man was gaunt, his skin ashen and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. He wore tattered clothing, soaked through from the storm, his bony hands trembling. His eyes, wide, sunken, and full of something not quite fear, but not quite sanity either, darted wildly around the room. McClinchey knelt beside him. "Easy, old-timer," he muttered, placing a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. The moment his fingers met the stranger's skin, a chill ran through him, not from the cold, but from something else, something unnatural. The man's lips parted, and a raspy whisper escaped. "I hear crows screaming every night as I go to sleep. Every night I burn." Boswell shut the door, locking out the storm, while McClinchey helped the man to his feet. "What's your name?" he asked. The stranger's gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the stove. His lips barely moved as he spoke. "Harlan Grace." The name meant nothing to either lawman, but the way he said it, like it was a curse, like it pained him to even utter it, made them uneasy. McClinchey and Boswell guided him to a chair near the fire, draping a blanket over his frail frame. He shivered violently as they handed him a tin cup of warm coffee, but he barely seemed aware of his surroundings. After a few moments of silence, he spoke again. "The crows. They call for me, and he comes." His voice cracked on the last word. Boswell frowned. "Who comes?" Grace's eyes gleamed in the firelight, distant and unfocused. "The one who burns." A gust of wind howled outside, and the fire flickered violently in the stove. The room seemed smaller, darker. McClinchey shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd encountered plenty of drifters, outlaws, and madmen in his time, but something about Grace was different. This wasn't simple delirium. This was something worse. The old man continued, his voice a lifeless whisper. "I don't stay anywhere twice. He finds me if I do. He makes me do things. Awful things." His breath hitched, his hands gripping the arms of the chair like he was trying to hold on to something unseen. "If I refuse, I burn." McClinchey ran a hand over his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. He wasn't a man prone to superstition, but something about the way Grace spoke, the raw fear in his voice, made the sheriff uneasy. "We'll let you rest here for the night," McClinchey said finally, nodding to Boswell. "Put him in the empty cell. Safer that way." Boswell hesitated before helping Grace to his feet. The man didn't resist, but as they passed the fire, his muttering resumed. "The crows, the flames." He clutched Boswell's arm, his fingers like ice. "Don't sleep. He comes in sleep." Boswell pried the old man's grip from his arm, guiding him into the cell and locking the door. Grace slumped onto the cot without another word. McClinchey poured himself a drink and sat back at his desk. He'd deal with Grace in the morning, let the man rest. Maybe then his words would make sense. But that night, sleep did not come easily. McClinchey found himself standing in a field of endless black, the sky above him a swirling mass of smoke. The air smelled of charred flesh, of something burning. Then the crows came. Hundreds, thousands, their cries deafening. They circled above him, and in their midst a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its body wrapped in something that smoldered and crackled like embers. Where its face should have been, there was only shadow. A voice, low, grating, filled with malice, spoke directly into his mind. "Kill him." McClinchey's breath caught in his throat. His hands moved on their own, reaching for the bone-handled knife at his hip. He tried to resist, but his body would not obey. "Kill Boswell." The figure stepped closer. The heat from its presence seared his skin. His fingers gripped the knife tighter. "Or you will burn." McClinchey jolted awake, his chest heaving. His fingers were wrapped around the hilt of his knife. His heart pounded against his ribs. He turned to Boswell, still sleeping soundly across the room. His gaze shifted to Grace's cell. The old man was gone. McClinchey leapt to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Boswell stirred, groggy from sleep. "What the hell?" McClinchey grabbed the keys and unlocked the cell, his hands shaking. The door swung open with a creak. Inside there was no sign of Grace. No blankets, no footprints in the dust. Only the scorch mark. It was the shape of a man, and it was still smoldering. McClinchey's breath hitched. He stepped back, his mind racing. That was impossible. Then he felt it. An unnatural force, a weight in the air, and his hand, his traitorous, trembling hand, slowly raised the knife. McClinchey's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he fought against the invisible force tightening around his arm. His fingers clenched the bone-handled knife with a will of their own, and though he tried to loosen his grip, his body refused to obey. Boswell, still groggy, rubbed his eyes and sat up. "Sheriff," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He frowned when he saw McClinchey standing at the open cell door, the knife gleaming in the flickering lamplight. McClinchey tried to warn him, to speak, to move, but his body was not his own. Boswell's face twisted with confusion. "Elric, what are you?" Then without hesitation, McClinchey struck. The blade slashed across Boswell's throat in one swift, brutal motion. A wet, gurgling sound filled the room as Boswell clutched his neck, staggering backward, knocking over the desk. Blood spilled over his fingers, dark and thick, staining his uniform. He fell onto the wooden floor, gasping, choking, his wide, terrified eyes locked onto McClinchey's. And just like that, the weight lifted. The sheriff stumbled back, his knife clattering to the ground. His body was his again, but it was too late. Boswell twitched once, twice, then went still. The room smelled of blood and burning. McClinchey dropped to his knees, pressing his hands to Boswell's wound, but it was useless. His deputy, his friend, was gone. A cold wind howled through the jailhouse and the lamp flames flickered wildly. The door, still bolted shut, rattled as if something outside wanted in. Then in the silence came the sound of wings. A single crow cawed from the rafters. Then another, then a dozen. The shadows above twisted and the room darkened. McClinchey's breath hitched as a familiar scent filled the air. Burning wood, burning flesh. He didn't have to turn around to know. It was here. A voice, low and grating, spoke from the darkness. "You understand now." McClinchey turned slowly. The figure from his dream stood in the cell, the scorch mark beneath its feet. Its body smoldered like dying embers, smoke rising from the jagged cracks along its blackened skin. Its face was still a void, a mass of shifting darkness. But its eyes burned like coals. McClinchey tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room rose. The air shimmered with heat. "You are mine now." McClinchey's mouth went dry. He wanted to speak, to beg, to fight, but what was there to say? He had killed Boswell, not by choice, but by the force of something beyond his comprehension. And now he understood what Harlan Grace had meant. It wouldn't let him go. The sheriff took a shaky breath. "What are you?" The figure did not answer. Instead, it raised a charred hand and pointed at the open cell. McClinchey followed its gaze. The scorch mark was still there. Only now it had changed. It was no longer a single burned outline. There were two. One of them was new. One of them was his. A soundless scream built in his throat, but before it could escape, the world tilted. The shadows swirled around him, the crows shrieked, and fire consumed everything. The next morning, the people of Medicine Bow gathered outside the jailhouse, whispering in uneasy tones. Judge A.C. Campbell arrived, summoned by the panicked cries of a stable boy who had peered through the window at sunrise and seen something that left him pale and shaking. Inside the jail, they found Deputy Boswell dead on the floor, his throat slashed. The sheriff stood motionless over him, his knife still in hand, his eyes blank. He did not respond when they spoke his name. He did not flinch when they grabbed his arms and wrestled the weapon away. He did not resist when they locked him in the cell. He was breathing, but it was as if something had hollowed him out. The townsfolk muttered among themselves. Some said McClinchey had lost his mind. Some whispered of possession, of dark forces that should not be spoken of. Others recalled the drifter, Harlan Grace, and the things he had said the night before. Judge Campbell frowned as he examined the cell floor. What in God's name? The burn marks remained, and now there were two. 3 days later, Marshal Langston arrived from Laramie to take McClinchey into custody. He expected a man driven mad by guilt, a murderer in need of swift justice. Instead, he found an empty cell. The sheriff was gone. The door had remained locked all night. The guards swore no one had entered or exited. There were no tracks in the dust, no sign of struggle, just the cell, the scorch marks, and the silence. A search party was formed, but McClinchey was never found. Over the years, there were rumors. Drifters claimed to have seen him wandering alone through the wilderness, muttering to himself, his eyes vacant. Others said he had been spotted in distant towns, never staying in one place for long, always vanishing before morning. And some, those who truly listened, spoke of crows. They said that wherever McClinchey went, the crows followed, that on cold, stormy nights, you could hear them screaming. And if you ever met a man with empty eyes, a man who smelled faintly of smoke, a man who whispered of fire in his sleep, you should never let him stay the night, because if you did, the burned man would come for you too.